And then in verse 7, the people who he is addressing. And then, of course, his typical greeting, grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, with which we open a considerable number of our services here at the church if you follow the liturgy. It's funny, people complain about the liturgy. Sometimes I've even heard people say that the liturgy is not biblical. But you hear more from the Bible in any standard liturgy than you'll hear in any other kind of a church service. All of the liturgical, they come right out of the Bible. It's just funny. Somebody said that to me a couple months ago. They said the liturgy is not biblical. And I thought, how many liturgies have you sat through? I mean, they're very, very biblical. And then in verse 8, Paul discusses his longing to visit Rome, and he hasn't met these people. He did not found this church. He doesn't know who they are, but he does know that their reputation as a major bastion of Christianity is known throughout the ancient world by the time he's arriving. And now it seems like he's going to be able to visit. It's going to be a stopping point on his way to Spain. He wants to preach in the extreme west of the Roman Empire. And in some ways, you get the idea to preach the gospel where it's never been heard before. And so he's hoping that he can share some things that will build the Roman church and that they can share some things with him. Not to put too fine a point on it, probably money and support to help him on his journey west. Verse 14, I am under obligation both to Greeks, those would be educated pagans, and to barbarians, those would be the uneducated types. And he specifies the wise and the foolish. The wise and the foolish. So he is also eager to preach the gospel to those who are in Rome. And then in verse 16 and 17, this is where we ended last week and where we'll pick up today. This was one of my memory verses when I was in a youth group back in the day. I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. To the Jew first, also to the Greek, reading from the ESV here. For in it, that is the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, and here he quotes the prophet Habakkuk, the righteous shall live by faith. So there's a fair amount of unanimity that, given the form of the letter, this is Paul's main thesis. And this is a very succinct expression of what the gospel is. Now we know Godspell is a Germanic word meaning good news. The Greek word, well, what's the Greek equivalent? Euangelion. So EU, good, angelion, message. An angel is a messenger. An angelion is a message. So the good news. It is interesting, and there's been a lot of discussion that the good news is, he says it's the power of God. And so it may involve doctrinal belief. It certainly does. But that's not the main issue. The main issue is that in and through what is preached, there is a power. There is a power that is at work that accomplishes something. It accomplishes salvation for everybody who believes. And here he comes back to the Jew first, then the Greek. So the priority of the Jewish people. We know from the Gospels that Jesus preached first and foremost among the Jews. And at a certain point, him crossing over into Gentile territory was considered a big deal. So it was first to the Jews and then to the Greeks. And then in verse 17, a lot of discussion about this phrase. In it, the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Let me stop and see if there's any question or comment before we kind of jump on that issue. I'll reiterate a little bit of what I said last week, but this will be, Dad. Yeah.
Only that when he talks about the gospel here, probably should be connected to what he says at the very beginning, that it is the gospel about God's Son, which he calls the gospel of God, who is descended from David and declared to be the Son of God in power. But good news is more of a general word, but he's been more specific early on. What he means by the gospel is the gospel of God. Son.
Yeah, well, and in chapter 1, verse 2, he says it's been promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. So the prophets are first and foremost, for Paul, those who have announced the good news in advance. And this quote, the righteous will live by faith, is from the prophet Habakkuk. But Paul, being a Jew, and in his pre-Christian existence, a Pharisee, knows the books of the prophets well. We just finished a class not too long ago on Ezekiel. And in Ezekiel, you may recall, there is this idea that although the nation of Israel, which has been elected by God to be his representatives on earth, they have failed. They have failed in their covenant obligations. They've worshipped other gods, and they haven't done what they said they were going to do. God will redeem them in his due time and make his promises fulfilled among the nations. What are his promises? He will be their God and they will be his people. A kingdom in which justice and grace rules will be established. God's name, this is big for Ezekiel, the holiness of God's name will be vindicated. That's very, very big for Ezekiel, that God's name has been maligned through the failure of the people of Israel, and God will vindicate it. He will bring in non-Jews to the worship of the God of Israel. So he will regather the exiles. They will live in the land, and you can kind of multiply all of the different promises that he's going to bring about. So what Paul is saying, the prophets have been saying that the day of the Lord is coming. Yahweh will enter history. He will fulfill all of his promises, and he will do it in spite of the failure of Israel. And now Paul is saying that has happened. So when I get to this phrase, the righteousness of God, there's a lot of discussion about how to interpret that. But the direction I go with it, in at least this passage, God's righteousness is his faithfulness to his promises. He has elected Israel. He has made promises to Israel. And he is a righteous God, and he will live up to those promises. And the story of Jesus proves that. And that's probably also why he says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. Who's he talking to there? Probably his fellow Jews in Rome. Many, many Jews were under a lot of pressure when they became Christians because they worshiped a crucified Messiah who died as a criminal under the Roman government, and some of them were even being put out of the synagogues. The book of Hebrews particularly, and quite a few other letters of the New Testament, are to encourage Jews not to give up on their Christian faith because of the pressure that they are receiving from their fellow Jews. They're going to be made fun of. They're going to be put out of the synagogue. They're going to be maligned. And Paul is saying he is not ashamed. Why is he not ashamed of the gospel? Because this is what he's saying. It's the fulfillment of everything we've been talking about for centuries. What's there to be ashamed of? This is the moment we've been waiting for. Now let me stop and see if there's any question or comment about that. That's where we left off. You've got to say something. You said this is where you want me to pick up.
No, I'm just waiting for you to get to the...
Do
Do you want me to start now?
you, whenever you want.
So, if you could elucidate on this for me, and maybe with the help of Pastor Dan and probably David Glad, because David, knows
The
Romans.
Greek scholars.
He knows Romans more.
That's right.
So for what I understand, there's only three takes on the righteousness of God. It's an attribute of God, is what he's talking about, or the Luther thing that it's something that can be imputed to us, a forensic righteousness, or it's actually the saving action of God. Can you comment on all three, and then tell me what the exact answer is to all of it, so I don't have to worry about it ever again.
All right, so Brother Doug is, again, and this is for the recording too, so yeah, I've presented it in the background and I've given what I'm going to do in the class. Martin Luther understood this phrase, the righteousness of God, in this way. That's one of the different, that because of our moral failure, and we can never live up to God's commands. In and through Christ, we are clothed in Christ's righteousness. And that protects us from the judgment, that we justly deserve for our failure. Now, I would argue, actually, that Luther is quite right, that is a real dynamic of the gospel. In fact, you find it particularly in Philippians.
You find it in Colossians. Do you find that elsewhere?
You do, yes.
But the question, I guess, really comes down to what does it mean here?
I don't think that's what it means here.
I didn't think you did.
I don't. And I can give you my reasons.
But I just want to back up.
Yeah.
You do, but the imputation of righteousness, you see that in other parts of the New Testament.
You do.
Okay, so
You do.
That's,
So
that's not even an issue as far as whether you believe in that or not. You do. So
I do believe in that. So
what is it in verse 17?
in verse 17, it doesn't make sense that Paul would introduce that issue here at the front end of his letter. It's his audience. He didn't found this church. They don't know of. Would be too early in the letter to jump right into the mechanics of salvation. He's talking to a mixed Jewish-Gentile congregation, particularly the Jews. The most relevant thing to say here is, look, God has fulfilled his promises to Israel in Jesus Christ. That's the most sensible thing to say. Now, if he wants to, later in the letter, go into those mechanics of salvation, he may use the phrase, the righteousness of God, that way. So that's why I don't think that's probably what's happening in this particular passage. But as we said in previous lessons, the phrase, the righteousness of God, may mean different things to Paul in different parts of his letters. And so one of the reasons why the new perspective issue ruffles feathers is because some people will argue that Paul means what I think he means in this passage. And they may even then argue that he means that in every passage that it occurs and try to set aside certain dogmas of the Reformation Church. Yeah.
One of the problems with this passage in the Greek text is that it is a genitive phrase.
Okay.
Which is
Yep.
ambiguous. Now, you hear from time to time people say, well, Greek is very precise, much more precise than English.
Yeah.
No, that's just not true. Well, that's said by somebody who's never studied Greek.
Or any other ancient language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is an ambiguity here, and every translator or reader in the Greek text has to make a decision. Is this an objective genitive or is this a subjective genitive?
Right.
You've got two basic grammatical options. Both of them are defensible. Both of them are quite possible, which leaves you with this ambiguity. In the end, I guess I don't think the world rises or falls on interpreting in this phrase, in this verse, one way or the other. So long as whoever's doing the interpreting doesn't interpret it one way and then try to bleed that over into a bunch of other areas, either to accept or deny certain kinds of ideas.
Yeah.
And that's one of the problems. This is an ambiguous phrase here. It just flat out is.
Well, and we've got a number of young people here who've studied Latin, and you've done some Greek, and you know that one of the joys of Latin or Greek or any ancient language is you do have to make decisions about how you're going to translate a phrase. You may have 2, 3, sometimes 4 different possible ways to render something, and you have to make that decision. So the reason why I interpret the text the way I do in verse 16, 17, is not really hang on the Greek, because the Greek is ambiguous here. It could go different directions. That's one of the reasons why learning some of the original languages can be helpful. By the time the translation comes into your hand, all of the fun stuff's been done. Because, and here's something you can tuck away in the back of your mind, every translation is an interpretation. You cannot translate a text without it. It's not like, well, you translate it and then you interpret it. No. Well, you interpret when you translate. And that's why there's a lot of anxiety about which translation do you use? Who does it come from? How much integrity lies behind what they do? And do they footnote things? If the translator makes a decision, that's fine. But does he inform the reader that such a decision has been made? And that's one of those areas, particularly in Protestant circles. You don't have to worry about that in Catholic circles, because you say, well, ask your priest, he'll tell you. But in Protestant circles, we kind of dig into the text, right? And we want to hang on to that as closely as we can.
So is it somewhat disingenuous for interpretations to say, oh, well, this is word for word?
It is, because I think it misleads the reader into thinking that the translation they have in front of them is the only accurate one, you know.
I've had people come to me and say, oh, well, this version is more word for word, and I kind of roll my eyes.
There's something to it. I mean, some translations make a greater effort to be faithful to the original language than others. So I would say some translations have a greater measure of integrity than others, and other translations are more blatantly doctrinaire, about what it is that they want to push. 1 second. David, you had a comment.
Just a comment that the Bible I use most of the time it's a kind of a parallel Bible.
Mm-hmm.
It has the English Revised Version, which is a very old translation. But one of the things I like about that version is, as much as possible, the translators will tell you in the footnotes alternative translations. I mean, they're not going to get all of them in.
Yeah.
It's impossible. But they will tell you some of the major, quite a bit. They will tell you, not verse by verse, but in a passage like this, I haven't looked at this in that version. They will tell you this could be translated this way, and
Mm-hmm.
it could be totally real.
Well, and some of you have had parallel Bibles, right? Where they'll have this version and that version, and that Origin of Alexandria is probably the first to do that. And that was back in the 3rd century. So already scholarly Christians were realizing that their scriptures could be read in different ways, and you had one.
I'll just say, to the present, the ESV has left the ambiguity in their translation.
Mm-hmm.
They've not tried to go one way or the other. There are translations that do. If you would translate this, for instance, as I'm not ashamed of the gospel, etc., for in it the righteousness God gives is revealed, that goes one direction. It makes a decision for you out of the options. It doesn't tell you what the other option is, which I would think is doubtful that you ought to do that. On the other hand, if you would translate it, for in it the righteousness that God has is revealed, then they've gone the other direction.
So I'm glad that's a good example. So we have this expression. It's a genitive expression. Some of the Latin students, they know what a genitive is. It could mean the righteousness God gives. It could mean the righteousness God has. That's what Dad was talking about a moment ago, and he said an objective genitive or a subjective genitive. I don't think for most of you that probably what on earth does that mean? That's grammatical rigmarole. What it means, though, is that one expression, the righteousness of God, is kind of fuzzy. It could mean the righteousness God gives. That would be a more Lutheran idea. God gives his righteousness to those who put their faith in him. Or the righteousness God has. That's the approach that I'm taking with this passage. God is a righteous God, keeps his promises. Can it be solved on grammatical grounds alone? No, it can't. And so learning Greek and Hebrew is wonderful. It's not going to fix everything for you. Or just having, this is not your typical Sunday. This is not a typical Sunday school class. Oh my goodness. We've got several people who've studied Greek here in this class. Quite a few that read commentaries and theologians of different sorts. But realistically, this is what this is what churches should be doing. We should be having these discussions. Contextually, Paul has said in Romans chapter 1, the gospel was proclaimed by the prophets. The prophets are the ones who foretold that this day would come. And he's saying to his fellow Jews, I'm not ashamed of this. I am not ashamed to say that I put my faith in Christ. Why? Because this is what we have been preaching about for centuries. It's God's power for salvation, not only to the Jewish people, who he's going to regather the exiles, but to the Gentile as well. Every nation under earth is going to worship the God of Israel. And it's remarkable because if what he said wasn't true, we wouldn't all be here today, unless there were a lot of Jewish people in here. But technically speaking, we worship the God of Israel. And that's remarkable because the God of Israel really appears in the early passages of the Bible to be kind of a tribal deity, a provincial God of some local insignificant people. And yet there is no corner of planet Earth today where people do not wake up every morning and bow their knee to the God of Israel. And I'm one of them. So that's a remarkable thing. And that is a fitting introduction to what Paul is saying in the letter to the Romans. So if he uses the righteousness of God in a different sense, in a Lutheran sense, imputation of righteousness in other paths, that's fine. And the new perspective on Paul, which we talked about a week or two ago, can go different directions. Some people will use it to get away from Reformation teaching. Other people feel it's entirely compatible with Reformation teaching as long as we are, we're trying to understand what Paul is saying in any given passage that he's talking about. Yeah.
Well, that idea of the nations, we were just saying about bowing to the God of Israel, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Yeah.
You find it, for instance, David talks about it in the Psalms and so on. You start cross-referencing that throughout the Old Testament, and it's, you read it, you pass over it, but you start, you see how much it's being referred to in the Old Testament. It's a lot.
It's quite a lot. Psalm 2, right?
And so we're seeing that fulfilled all the time.
Psalm 2, the nations rage against Yahweh and his Messiah. And the Lord, Yahweh in heaven, laughs. You know, it's kind of edgy. Scoffs. But the idea that David would have a ruler come from his body who would rule the whole earth for all eternity, that's quite a promise. It's fitting that we're talking about this because it's Christmas time. And that is the promise that the prophets believed that. And they believed it at a time when it wasn't looking like anything was going to happen. You know, Isaiah believed it. Jeremiah believed it. Ezekiel believed it. They believed that the God of Israel would one day become the God of every nation in the world. And so that's what I think Paul is talking about. God is righteous. He keeps his word. He makes a promise and he brings it to fulfillment. And Paul is telling his other Jews, you need to get on board with this. This is what we've been praying about. This is what we've been expecting. So he's not ashamed of it. I think that makes the most sense in this context. Though if, he wants to talk about imputation in other passages, that's okay. That's okay. So I killed about a half hour on that, but I knew we were going to hit it today because this opening verse it's the thesis of the whole letter. So we can't just sweep it under the rug. We've got to settle it. And the interpretation that I'm offering here is a little different than what Protestant pastors sometimes go on this particular verse. And I think sometimes it's because there's a lot of worry anytime you reassess something that has been a mainstay for several centuries. That's not a small deal. That's a big deal, and so it has to be talked about. Yeah.
I'm sorry to keep annoying you.
No, you're not annoying me. I'm enjoying
I just want
this.
to say two things. First of all, am I allowed to have a further conversation with you and Pastor Dan and David potentially?
Absolutely not.
And number two, if you think that I wasted a lot of time on this, wait till we get to the rest of chapter 1. You have no idea how much time we're going to waste.
No, it's the letter to the Romans. And I know I disappointed you in Ezekiel with the,
No,
you'll never get over that.
Bring it back up. I put it behind me and forget it now.
No. So, if you have the other lesson, let's take a look at it. Beginning on page 9, beginning chapter 1, verse 18, and this lesson goes through the 3rd chapter through verse 20. I should say it's dangerous territory because this letter by Paul has been interpreted, translated, maybe as much as any document that's ever been written in Western history. So I don't propose to come forward and answer all 2,000 years of Christian history, I'm going to settle it for you. The important thing, though, is to be above board. What does the text tell us? What are the different ideas? And how can we engage with it? So, Paul does call the gospel his gospel. Chapter 2, verse 16. But he doesn't mean it's different than that of the other apostles. He does indicate in Galatians, he really was very concerned to make sure when he visited the other apostles in Jerusalem that he was saying the same thing substantially that they were. Peter, James, and John all extended to Paul the right hand of fellowship. I always joke about that phrase because sometimes churches give you the left foot of fellowship. So there's the right hand of fellowship and there's the left foot of fellowship. But what that meant is that Paul was a very difficult person to know how to deal with. He was taking the gospel and doing things with it that went beyond, I think, what even the original apostles themselves understood. But they were confident that God's work was in it, and they supported it. The main issue is that his was a special calling. He was trying to bring in non-Jews into belief in the God of Israel. And in his doing of that, many of the rituals that for the Jews for many, many hundreds of years had been the defining feature of who they were, circumcision, sacrificing animals at the temple, going through ritual washing. Paul was telling new believers that they didn't have to do all of that. And that was a big issue. Now, James, the half-brother of Jesus, supported Paul in this, and that was a big deal because James was well known even in, you can find him even in Flavius Josephus, as a Torah-observant Jew. Even people who did not believe in Jesus were impressed by how scrupulous James was in keeping the Torah. So nobody could say that his support of Paul was because he didn't follow the law of Moses. He followed the law of Moses to the letter. And so we haven't got time to, I would love to teach a whole class on James, the brother of Jesus. He's an interesting character because on the one hand, he supports what Paul is doing, and on the other hand, he's as Jewish as any Christian could possibly come. So his support was huge for Paul. So when I mentioned Peter, James, and John, James here, I'm not talking about the son of Zebedee, the fisherman. I'm talking about the half-brother of Jesus who ran the church in Jerusalem and whose flock was mostly Jews who believed in Jesus but continued to observe the law of Moses. The main issue in this lesson, though, is sin. And so I mentioned that man is without God in the world, and that's the definition that I'm going to run with because sin is a tricky issue. It's a big word, and a lot of times in certain circles we can give it. We all know that we're sinners in some sense. But why are we sinners? What is it that is wrong in our life? Now, in certain circles from my family on the frontier and different parts of the South and Southwest, sin meant drinking, card playing, and gambling. Not that those are to be encouraged. You can do any of those three things at the 7-Eleven if you wish. You know, you can get you get your lottery ticket, your liquor, and your cigarettes. It's interesting how the local party store has all of your bad habits there in one place. So you don't have to run around town in order to get them all. You can hit them all at the same spot. But in some ways, that's also trivializing because it suggests that if you got over those bad habits, then you would be in the clear. And it's like, well, no. Sinners work in soup kitchens for the poor, too. In other words, you can do good deeds for other people and have an otherwise clean life and still be a sinner. So sin runs deep in the race. And a lot of times in America particularly, it's been so associated with sort of external behaviors that people can get a very self-righteous think that they're otherwise clean, then they don't think that they're really all that badly off. And so what we want to do in this particular lesson is talk about what does Paul mean by the word sin? What exactly is going on here? Did you have a comment? Yeah.
We're getting into that.
Oh, well, you go ahead and say it anyways, because you're there.
It seems like it must include both inherent sin. Adam and Eve brought sin into the world, and we were all affected by that.
Yep.
And then, of course, there's behavioral sin.
Well, and that's an important issue too, is that as humans, in the ancient world, people tended to think of themselves as members of a group. Ancient tragedy, if you watch plays or like that, we don't have a really appreciation for Greek tragedy because Greek tragedy, you're the victim. You are the victim of circumstances and family heredity and problems that are beyond your ability to control. It's something that happens to you. You're just corrupt. And there's nothing you can do about it. Modern tragedies, modern playwrights don't really have a feeling for tragedy because the guy who does things, he's responsible for everything that he's done. He's just a bad guy. And so somewhere between I'm free and an individual and responsible for everything that I do, it's kind of a modern sense, and I've been born into this rotten situation that I didn't ask for anything. But the truth involves both, right? That's why we say in the liturgy, have mercy on us. I got emotional all of a sudden. Miserable offenders. That's the phrase, but the idea is that we're guilty because we do things that we know that we shouldn't do, but on the other hand, we're miserable offenders. We are also victims of things beyond our control because we aren't just individuals in the Enlightenment sense, like dice rattling around in a box that have nothing to do with each other. We're connected to one another. There's nothing wrong with me that doesn't go back generations. And all of that, you are married, have been married, you know that about your spouse and your children and the people that you know. It runs in the family, right? There are problems that each generation inherits from the previous one, and yet it doesn't absolve us of our guilt because all of us add our own token to the pile of human misery in our own special way. So sometimes Christians have not always appreciated both sides of this issue of sin. Yeah.
There's also the side of sin, which is not something you do, it's something you don't do that you should do.
Yeah.
So, in one passage it says to the person who knows to do good and doesn't do it, to him it is sin. So sin is also the absence of doing what you ought to do, as well as just doing behaviors that you ought not to do.
Yeah. And that's also in the liturgy. Forgive us for the things we have done. Forgive us for the things we have left undone. And that's tough. You have your 10 commandments, your thou shalt nots. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, yada, yada, yada. But the greatest commandment is performative. You shall love the Lord. So even if I avoid all of the nasty behavior that I could avoid, do I love God? Do I love my neighbor? And by love, do I live sacrificially on behalf of God and my neighbor? So the idea that I put here in the lesson is that, I just put it here on page 9, to be without God in the world. So sin at the deepest level is godlessness. There are different levels of godlessness, but Paul's going to talk about that here because in his discussion with the Romans, he does need to talk about what does Christ save us from. He saves us. It's the power of God for the salvation. Salvation from what? I mentioned here, last paragraph in the initial section, Paul nowhere concerns himself with the eternal destiny of infants, children, or otherwise incapable people. And that's important because those issues are foremost on the minds of a lot of people in our time. They don't even come up in the biblical books almost ever. His focus is on responsible adults. So when Paul is discussing sin, he is largely concerned with grown, responsible people. Nowhere does he discuss the fate of children who die before they're practically out of the womb. Nowhere does he discuss children who haven't yet come of the age of responsible decision-making. Nowhere does he discuss, I say here incapable people, but people who for one reason or another are mentally unable to make decisions as responsible adults. And that'll be important because a lot of times Paul's statements in this section have been commandeered, I think, to address situations beyond what he is really talking about. And Christians are going to take different positions on those kinds of issues. And so that I want to say up front. His focus is on responsible adults. Here, however, if we're talking about responsible adults, not infants, not children, not people who are mentally challenged in some way, the basic problem with the human race is not ignorance or weakness, though he does not deny that ignorance and weakness are real or that they have a mitigating effect on the moral culpability of people, but man is in rebellion against God. That's his main issue here. People are ignorant, but they suppress what they could know if they wanted to know. We all know what goes on there. Many of us are ignorant, but ignorance, is a problem that takes a lot of work to maintain. You have to maintain the problem of ignorance with considerable time, energy, and effort. I speak as a father, as a pastor, as a teacher of young people. Ignorance is a problem, but there's a lot of energy that goes into the maintenance of this problem. In other words, don't we make efforts to keep ourselves ignorant of things that we otherwise could know about? Of course we do. So that's what Paul talks about, the suppression of truth, or what lurks behind the phrase, I don't want to know about it. Well, of course you don't. Because we all know, and kids know by the time they're 2, 3 years old, that with knowledge comes responsibility. We're not doing Viktor Frankl, but we did mention that passage where he says, in addition to the Statue of Liberty in the East Coast, we need to build a Statue of Responsibility on the West Coast.
They wouldn't put up with that.
But I always thought that was very, very clever. I don't know what the Statue of Responsibility would look like. But if
Probably like a prisoner with a ball and chain.
oh, jeez. They got a torch in one and a ball and chain on the other. Okay. I don't think they're going to like that. No. So ignorance is an issue, but our will plays a role in our own ignorance. We keep ourselves in a state of ignorance. And that goes back to a statement we made just a few moments ago. He who knows the good he ought to do and does not do it also sins. In other words, we take steps to keep ourselves in a state of infancy and keep others around us in a state of infancy. We don't grow to the full extent that we're capable. And also, it's not just weakness because we refuse to humble ourselves under the assistance of those who are stronger out of pride. So pride is an issue. We don't want to receive help. We're too proud to receive help, even when we need help. And so ignorance is a thing, and weakness is a thing, but there's a vital nerve of rebellion that lies deep in the human spirit. And this applies to us as individuals, not to members of a group. It's not that the men are the problem, or the women are the problem, or the whites are the problem, or the blacks are the problem, or the rich are the problem, or the poor are the problem. We as individuals, as free individuals, are the problem. And that's probably important for us to hear in our own time because there's a lot of identity politics in the air, and everybody is still trying to lay it at the feet of some group. If a person is rich, then we have the right to hate them. I don't think so. If a person is powerful. Now, that's reversed. There were times when people thought if a person was poor, we have the right to hate them. If a person was black, we have the right to hate them. But now the tables are turned. It's perfectly all right to hate a person because they're white or rich or powerful. That's not a solution. It's just playing the same old game all over again. The issue is with us as individuals. And so we can't just lay all of our problems at the feet of some group. We have to accept personal individual responsibility.
There's a really neat line on that from G.K. Chesterton, who asked the question, what's wrong with the world? He says, I'm wrong with the world. Which I think is a good way of saying it.
Well, Chesterton has a good way of summarizing deep thoughts in a pithy, short saying. He was very good at that. So we're going to mention this first phrase, and this will be the cliffhanger for next week. Chapter 1, verse 18, and Karl Barth spent a lot of time on this in his commentary in the Romans. For the wrath of God is, that important thing about that verb, present tense, revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. So there, the wrath of God's a Greek phrase. I mentioned here on page 9, orge theou. Orge is we still use it in the phrase orgy, though that's come to have sexual connotations. But the idea of anger or wrath is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness, asebeia. The Latin phrase would be impiety, something of that sort. And unrighteousness, adikia, injustice of men. So that men, basically, this is our first commandment. They don't love God and they don't love their neighbor. They hate God and they hate their neighbor. Impiety and injustice. We as human beings have a duty, not just on a horizontal plane to our fellow man, but also to God on the vertical plane. And Paul is saying that the wrath of God isn't, he's not saying it's coming. He's saying it is presently evident in the world around us. All you got to do is look around and you will see that God's wrath is already upon us. We'll have to talk about, well, what does that mean? Because we're used to the words of the prophets, get our house in order or God's going to bring it. That's sort of like the message of the Old Testament prophets. But Paul is talking about this as though it's already evident in the world around us. And that's a powerful statement. Yeah.
Question. Do you think, and maybe this will come up next week, but talks about the wrath of God, is there such a thing as the passive wrath of God as opposed to the active wrath of God? He's going to use this language, God gives them over to, gives them up to, and so
Yes.
as he goes on, which sounds to me a little bit like there's such a thing as the passive wrath of God. He lets them get into their own trouble and boil in their own pudding, so to speak.
Well, and the things that he says in the passages that immediately follow definitely have a passive sense. God gave them over to X. God gave them over to Y. God gave them over to Z. So, I think there's a difference between active wrath and passive wrath. So, I got a great example. Active and passive. I don't know if any of you guys remember this. There was an electric fence not far from our yard, kept in the neighbor dog, that I repeatedly told one of my children not to go near that fence. Now, active wrath would be to sweep them up and spank them on the bottom the moment I saw them doing what I told them not to do. But I engaged in a little passive wrath. I was grilling burgers in the backyard, and I saw one of my kids moving toward the forbidden fruit, the fence, desiring the knowledge of good and evil for themselves. Because they didn't believe that I knew what I was talking about. And they're going to find out. And there was always the look over the shoulder. Am I being watched? I knew everything. I was flipping burgers. There they go. So I gave them over to their devices. And their eyes were opened. Now, you could say, well, that's cruelty, but, I think that's what you're talking about. Active wrath is a sort of direct intervention and punishment. But you can punish people by letting them follow their path, right? And sometimes at a certain point, that's the best punishment. Sometimes it's the only punishment because, well, you know how it is. You've dealt with people, and how you've dealt with people in situations you feel like the only way they're going to learn this lesson is if we allow them to follow it through to its conclusion, right? And so sometimes you have to do that. So maybe you can learn a little bit about parenting from God's way. That's a good distinction. David.
I once heard the famous preacher John Stott talk about this word, orgate.
Oh, yes.
And he said that wrath, for a lot of people, has the connotation of somebody basically losing their temper, becoming kind of petulant, or,
Okay, yes.
He said there's nothing of that in this word. He says this word means God's holy hatred of sin. And that's what this is. It's not the way we think of wrath at a human level at all.
Well, we'll probably end on that note, but I think that's right. And that goes back to classical writing. Wrath, even in Homer's Iliad, major theme of the poem, is indignation at something that is wrong. So it's not just losing your temper.
Yeah, that's what he said. A lot of people.
I know it, the wrath in that sense, losing your temper. I remember driving in the car and the kids were misbehaving in the back. I turned my arm around and whacked whoever I hit. It's just kind of random. I'm not saying that was the right thing to do, but that was just like, okay, somebody's going to get it, and I don't care who, as long as I make a point. But no, this is more a matter of there has been a transgression of what is highest and holiest in a faithfulness, a just faithfulness to that principle. And in some ways, that kind of wrath is far more serious to deal with than just loss of temper, because it'll follow through to the satisfaction of the principle that it's defending. I would much rather actually deal with a short-tempered parent than one who is after me about a principle. You see what I'm saying? Because one who's after me about a principle won't stop until the principle has been satisfied. So, yeah, this isn't a way of saying God is an emotional God who has bad days. This is a way of saying he's following through on something as a matter of justice. We're past time, though. I got to let you go, so we're going to pick up on this lesson next week. Good first half of the class discussion, and I think a lot of good stuff second half, so I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.